I'm Mehdi Hasan.
I'm Owen Jones.
And we're too outspoken. Welcome to a second episode of this new segment we're doing for Zateo. Owen, thanks for coming back and joining me to talk about basically everything that's going on. And there's been a lot going on since we last spoke.
Quite a fair bit. I wouldn't be anywhere else, Mehdi, obviously. I think we'll see the fat. We'll work out most of the world's problems in
We have to work out most of the world's problems in the next half hour. So the biggest issue right now should be what's still going on in Gaza. But what's actually become the biggest news story are the college protests, which are spreading from the US to everyone. I want to talk to you about what's happening in the UK as well. You're obviously in London, I'm in DC. But I want to kick off, Owen, just by reminding our viewers about, last time we spoke about how you were born in 1984 and I'm born in 1979. We talked a lot about age. Let's go back today to 1963. Right before either of us were born, April 63. I've got it right here. I want to read from those of you who are not familiar with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous letter from, and we're both from England, so I'm going to say Birmingham jail, even though it's Birmingham jail in the US. His letter from a Birmingham jail, where he says, Owen, I'm sure you've seen the letter. I must confess that over the past few years, I've been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I've almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's greatest stumbling block in his stride towards freedom is not the white Citizens Council or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who's more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom. When I read that, Owen, and I was reading that again yesterday, I think of what Joe Biden said this week about all of the college campus protests, anti-war protests, anti-Israel bombing Gaza protests that have taken over our news cycle. Just have a listen, Owen, to what Joe Biden said this week in the context of that letter from MLK.
So let me be clear. Peaceful protest in America. Violent protest is not protected. Peaceful protest is. It's against the law when violence occurs. Destroying property is not a peaceful protest. It's against the law. Vandalism, trespassing, breaking windows, shutting down campuses, forcing the cancellation of classes and graduations. None of this is a peaceful protest. Threatening people, intimidating people, instilling fear in people is not peaceful protest. It's against the law. Dissent is essential to democracy, but dissent must never lead to disorder or to denying the rights of others so students can finish the semester and their college education.
Well, I have to say, listening to Joe Biden there, Martin Luther King had his number. Very astute, Martin Luther King. He'll go far. But I think, it's almost a cliched example, this, from Joe Biden, of a certain type of centrist, basically, who will fetishize the struggles of the past, won't they? They'll talk about the civil rights movements of the past, how they stood up and they fought injustice and they at huge cost and sacrifice. And, they would definitely have been on the right side then, that kind of thing. But when it comes to here and now, they're always on the wrong side and they seek to vilify these struggles. And sometimes it's concern trolling. If only you approach this a little bit differently, maybe I'd be on your side, which is obviously almost never the case. And I think it's interesting. I mean, obviously in the case of Joe Biden, they're not just protesting against Israel's war crimes, they're protesting Joe Biden facilitating them. Yeah. Martin Luther King's such a striking example because he's one of these rare historical figures, isn't he? He's now kind of revered to the extent of being a secular saint. Yeah. But in his time, he was really reviled. I mean, actually, It's really interesting if you look at the polling today, 94% of Americans say they've got a favorable view of Martin Luther King, 69% highly favorable. That is basically as popular as it's possible to get without being God. Yes. Now, when the civil rights movement gathered pace in the 60s, he became more and more unpopular. So in 1963, 37% of Americans had an unfavorable view of him. In 1965, 46% had an unfavorable view of him. And 2 years before his assassination in 1966, 63% of Americans had an unfavorable view. He was extremely unpopular. He was repeatedly accused of
because he turned against Vietnam, of course. It was the Vietnam War most unpopular, anti-war protests. And when you hear Joe Biden talking like the white moderate from MLK's letter, you have to ask yourself the question, like, what has happened in America? It's not like this is some obscure character. This is a very famous letter from the Birmingham jail. It's a very famous critique of the white moderate. And literally you hear Joe Biden saying this week, well, order is what matters.
I suppose what we're seeing here is this attempt to deflect from one of the great crimes of our age. Those who are complicit, directly complicit, Joe Biden, he's Genocide Joe, as he's now affectionately known by huge numbers of Americans. I mean, it's quite extraordinary if you look at the polling. The vast majority, a large majority of people who intend to vote for Joe Biden think Israel is committing genocide. So they're actively having to vote for a candidate they think is facilitating a genocide. But I think, the point is they're morally disgraced. They've lost public opinion. A large majority of Americans think, obviously, they oppose what Israel is doing. More Americans do not think it's genocide. So what we're seeing is this attempt to say the real hateful extremists are the people who are protesting against this. They're the ones who are, threatening disorder and all the rest. It's quite striking because, of course, there are no university campuses left in Gaza because they've been wiped off the map by Israel. But you see these students who will be treated just the same. I mean, it's really interesting again, actually, because if you look at the Vietnam War, back then, there was a poll in 1970. The vast majority of Americans thought college protests were caused by radical militant students. That was the number one reason, followed by irresponsible students who just want to cause trouble, followed by radical professors. I think what's interesting now is these protests actually have far more popular support than those protests did at the time. Then it took a very long time for people to turn against the Vietnam War. It took a long time for most Americans to buy into civil rights. So actually, one of the big differences now is if you look at the polling, they're far more on the side, these protesters, of where public opinion are at. So it's not a surprise you get the likes of Joe Biden desperately flailing around trying to say, well, the real problem are these protesters causing violence and extremism.
What they're doing is they're muddying the water, Owen, because yes, the majority of American public do believe in a ceasefire, and the majority of Democrats do believe it's a genocide. But what they've done, Owen, to make the protests unpopular, and what they've done throughout history, is to muddy what they're about. So when you look at the polling showing, there's a poll out, I thought this week, showing majority of American public don't support campus protests, think the police should shut them down. That's because they're presented to us as crazy radicals, Hamas supporters, nihilists, narcissists, students who don't know what the hell they're doing, violent outside agitators. If you read MLK's letter, he says they call us outside agitators, exactly the same language they're using now. And I've been to some of these campuses. I went to one in DC recently.
What's like the vibe? What's like the atmosphere when you go?
Oh my God, the atmosphere is so chilled and peaceful. People are, it's very communal. It's not what you're seeing on the news. And the funny thing is, what you're seeing on TV with the police crackdowns in places like Columbia and UCLA, that is the police bringing violence to those campuses, or counter protesters in UCLA who brought violence to these encampments. There's a study out that The Guardian reported on this week that shows, shock horror, surprise, surprise, 99% of the college protests have been completely peaceful. And when they talk about, trespassing is violence, well, no, trespassing is not violence. Property damage. We always know how, the people in power fetishize property. Apparently a window broken in Colombia is a bigger news story than, as you say, 12 colleges in Gaza, all 12 damaged or destroyed by the Israeli war machine funded by the US. So it is deeply frustrating to see how the protests are being misrepresented here. And I've been very critical of that. What about in the UK, Owen? Because you've had protests in London, in Birmingham. You've had arrests in the UK as well.
Yeah, I mean, they're not on the same scale. It's quite interesting. In the US, you've seen these campus, as you say, completely misrepresented. What you do is the media, they'll focus on particular incidents and then they'll say, this is the tip of the iceberg. This is what they really like. And it's actually just young, idealistic students who don't like watching mass slaughter. And here, just down the road from me is University College London. I studied there for a while, did an abortive PhD. I'm a dropout. But interestingly, that's got a history because back in 2010, you've got this big student movement in Britain where universities were occupied all over the country. And I took part in that occupation of UCL. And a lot of, people might know Novara Media, those sorts of kind of new left emerged partly from those occupations. So at the moment, an encampment's being set up at UCL. It's kind of at the beginnings. I know, the moment they're kind of just getting organised. You've got some in Manchester, Newcastle, and Leeds. So I think at the moment, it's quite, because I thought, I don't know, am I surprised? It took a while, I think, for these, because the focus has been the streets. We've had these massive protests in Britain every Saturday. And what's quite remarkable about that is we're 7 months in now, aren't we? 7 months into this horror and people are still mobilizing in hundreds of thousands. But I think now people are looking at the example of the US and they're trying to replicate it. But I don't know, it's interesting, isn't it? Because if you look back at these student protests, again, the way they're treated by media pundits, I mean, this is the same. If you look back, what's that expression? History doesn't always repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Yeah. And, the way that Vietnam protesters, these student protesters, were sneered at as though they were thick, basically. Yeah. They were stupid. They were dupes. They might be idealistic, but they were basically dupes.
Dirty as well. Remember this idea of dirty young people, dirty Marxists. Look, civil rights student protesters on the right side of history. Vietnam War protesters, student protesters on the right side of history. Anti-apartheid South Africa protesters on the right side of history. Iraq War protesters on the right side of history. At some point, you're going to say, are you sure you want to be on the anti-student protest side? That's what's so nuts. How people just want to ignore what's happened in the past.
Yeah, that's the thing. You get these it's not these politicians, like these newspaper columnists, these pundits who like to present themselves as they're really smart. They know what's going on. These are kids. These kids don't know. But actually, if you go through history on these big foreign policy or even domestic issues, the one side you want to be on is the side of the kids against the people who protest. They're the adults.
And the ones that you don't want to be on is actually Joe Biden's side. Joe Biden has been on the wrong side of every single one of those issues that I mentioned, from civil rights to Vietnam to apartheid to Iraq. Jeremy Scahill of The Intercept, my former colleague, wrote a piece about Biden a few years ago, and he writes this in here. He says, Biden professed a lack of moral outrage at the Vietnam War when he was a young man. He described walking through campus with law school friends one day and seeing other students occupying office buildings in protest. They were taking over the building, Biden said. And we looked up and said, look at these assholes. That's how far apart from the anti-war movement I was. Those are Joe Biden's words. Although he said assholes. That is Joe Biden. And I think, look, he'll come around to it on all those issues now. He's on the right side. As someone joked on Twitter yesterday, give Biden 20 years and he'll be on the side of the Gaza protesters as well.
I was going to say, it'd be interesting if you actually had a kind of properly functioning, a media ecosystem, because it'd be really interesting to put those questions to Joe Biden. The way you look back at all these protesters in the past, do you look back? What is true though? What would he say?
Can you imagine a press briefing, Mr. President? What you're saying now is what you said about every single other issue that you've changed course on. Yeah, that would be fantastic. If people are watching from the White House press corps, take up Owen's idea. Here, Owen, let me ask you this. You said it took a bit of a while in the UK for the encampments to get up. And even in the US, it's taken a bit of a while. And now it's, as they crack down on it, surprise, surprise, they spread more. But what I would say is we're about to see an absolute new level of horror in Gaza if/when the Netanyahu government goes into Rafah and crosses Joe Biden's red line, so-called, to go into Rafah and kill a lot of people. There are reports about, only women and children will be allowed to leave. All kind of fighting age adult males will be forced to stay in Rafah. Kind of sounds like Srebrenica, God forbid, if there's a massacre on that level. I wonder what will happen to these encampments and these protests in the coming days when we stop being distracted by media coverage of protesters and go back to covering what they're actually protesting against, especially with what's coming down the line with Rafah.
Yeah, and I don't even think about this. I don't think this is actually tinfoil hat wearing, but I don't think this is wild conspiracy theory mongering to say. I sort of think some of the clampdowns on these protests now are in anticipation of the fact that an invasion of Rafah could happen soon, which would be, it would just be catastrophic. It's catastrophic for a way I don't think people have really thought through how catastrophic we're talking here, because we're not just talking about the fact that Gaza now, its civilian infrastructure has been so destroyed, 70% civilian damage or destroyed or thereabouts, that it's now a different colour and texture when looked at from satellites. And Rafah is one of the only areas, it's still been heavily damaged, but nowhere near elsewhere. So that would just leave it inhospitable. It's not just that, it's not what little aid comes in has to go through Rafah. So you displace the majority of Gaza's population, obviously in Rafah now, which is, its pre-war population was infinitely smaller. They've got nowhere to go. And then the aid, what little aid, would just be completely and utterly disrupted when obviously famine's breaking out. And I just think, what you'll see then, I think, in that situation is, these student encampments have kind of laid the foundations for what I think would be a mass wave. You saw this in Vietnam. It was very infamous when you got the escalation of the bombing. I think it was in Cambodia, wasn't it? Where you got a sudden, basically, a kind of national rising on student campuses, which actually I hope that obviously history doesn't repeat itself, because students were shot in those, the Kent State massacre quite notoriously.
I should just point out a gun went off at Columbia this week. A police officer accidentally discharged his firearms. That was the biggest threat to students, not the protests, but a police officer.
Well, if you got, cops with guns this is what, this is when we talk about the threats to student safety, and it's quite striking because a lot of the people, amongst the people getting beaten up by pro-Israel mobs and being arrested are Jewish students who are obviously at the forefront, but no one's talking about their safety, not least with these cops, guns going off. This is ridiculous. Yeah, I just think, it is clear, and I just don't think this strategy is working. You're right, you pointed to polling where, every single time you get these protests, the public isn't sympathetic to the protests, but then later on they are, and they think they're always right after the event. But on the actual substantive issue, we've won this argument in the worst possible way, because, what winning this argument means is a lot of dead people and terrible destruction. But amongst public opinion, you know better than me, in the United States, it was kind of verboten to kind of criticize Israel. But now, the floodgates are opened. And I think a lot of those who are complicit, including the pundits who legitimized and rationalized and justified what happened, there's that incredible segment on CNN by one of their main anchors, which just, demonizing protests in a way you kind of expect from the kind of media outlet of a tin pot dictatorship. But, it's because they've lost, they're desperate, and they're, it's this attempt to deflect from the horrors that they're complicit in. What do you think? I just don't think, do they, maybe though, because, part of me thinks we let them get away with the Iraq war. Well, it's not like we let them get away, we just, they didn't face accountability.
No, they all rehabilitated themselves.
Different though? Is it different? Do you think?
They all rehabilitated themselves. Obviously, the President of the United States is someone who supported the Iraq war. Look, I look at what's happening with pundits and politicians on Gaza. I see them all over the place. By the way, you mentioned, we've talked a lot about how previous protests, as you say, demonized, then vindicated. I saw a great meme on Twitter, which said, a liberal is someone who supports every single civil rights protest except the current one, opposes every single war except the current one. So I thought that was a good summary of a version of that. But look, in terms of the people, right now, you've got this weird tension, especially here in Washington, D.C., where you see traditional allies of Israel, like Chuck Schumer. He comes out and says, Benjamin Netanyahu has a problem. He's got to go. But then this week, Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, has signed on to an invitation with the Republican House Speaker, Mike Johnson, inviting Netanyahu to speak in front of Congress, which is going to be insane. I don't know how members of Congress and the Democratic side are going to react to that. I don't know how protesters are going to react to that. But Bibi could be coming to DC to address the crowd. This guy who's in charge of an ongoing genocide. And of course, just that word genocide has caused so much controversy here. The Intercept reporting that the New York Times doesn't want its reporters to use the word. I was on with Piers Morgan this week, Owen, like you were a few months ago, and pressed him on exactly the same issue that you pressed him on about why won't you use the G word for Gaza? Why only for Ukraine? Why only for Hamas, but not for Israel?
The issue you said earlier, you said a word, double standards. I mean, I would be critical of your double standards, Piers. You constantly criticize Hamas for genocidal goals. And I just pointed out to you that the Israeli finance minister said this week he wanted the total annihilation of Gaza. Do you agree that's genocide?
Listen, I definitely think some of the members of that cabinet have used rhetoric which I think borders on genocidal, no question. But it's not as blatant.
Borders. Why not just genocidal, Piers? Why borders?
Well, okay. Look, you say it's genocidal.
I would say annihilation of Gaza.
Yeah, I would say it's deeply inflammatory rhetoric, but it's not quite the same as the Hamas spokesman saying on camera after October the 7th, we are going to keep doing this again and again and again. That's different.
It's much worse because the Israelis are literally doing it as we speak.
And they have a charter to get rid of it.
It's much worse, Piers.
They have a charter to eliminate Israel.
Tens of thousands of people.
Yeah, but see, but
they have tens of thousands of Palestinians.
You and I, Mehdi.
Hold on, Piers. Yeah. So does the Likud Party. 1977 Likud Party charter. What does it say? Between the sea and the Jordan, there will only be Israeli sovereignty. River to the sea. That's the Likud charter, Piers. I haven't heard you criticize the Likud charter.
But by the way, I just think this is really interesting, this point about, because when by the way, Brittany Dillon, as per, what a pro. What I think is, because when I spoke about it, basically his argument was it can't be genocide because it's self-defense. That was his view. I mean, let alone, look, just forget generations of what the Palestinians have gone through. There was a really brilliant piece actually written by a Holocaust scholar, an Israeli researcher at the University of Jerusalem. Yeah, the point, it's really interesting in that the history of genocide is not properly taught. And, it's far more common genocide than people think it, unfortunately, it is. And the problem then is the Holocaust becomes people's often sole reference point, when actually the Holocaust was an outlier in lots of ways, because it was an industrialized attempt to exterminate an entire people, and it was against an entirely defenseless civilian population. But the point this researcher made is that lots of genocides often have been framed as self-defense. So if you take Rwanda, which people are often familiar in terms of 1994, the Hutu extremists slaughtered Tutsi minority. But the argument they made, the Tutsis have been oppressed for a long time. And in 1990, a Tutsi rebel army invaded from Uganda. They invaded Rwanda. And by the way, committed lots of atrocities, killed lots of innocent people, accused of raping people, lots of other atrocities like that. And the Hutu extremists said they're going to commit genocide against us. Their argument was we have to kill them or they're going to kill us. Now, and the Rwandan Patriotic Front, I know by Paul Kagame is now the president, it continued to commit and killed huge numbers of innocent people. But everyone looks at that and understands that's a genocide, don't they? But it was framed as self-defense. The Bosnian Serbs is another one, by the way, in Bosnia. I mean, terrible atrocities were committed against Bosnian Serb civilians. And they justified the fact that they said that the Serbs had been exterminated by the Nazis. They were victims of genocide as well. And they used that experience. I don't know. Do you see what I mean? It's partly, I don't think Piers Morgan's ever read a book on genocide or anything, probably. But it's just that he taps into that lack of understanding, doesn't he? That people don't understand that actually genocide is actually far more common and they're often rationalized as self-defense.
Well, they're more common. Yes, they all use the self-defense argument. I mean, it's when back in the day when I used to argue about humanitarian interventions, Blair's whole humanitarian intervention, going back to Kosovo, Libya in 2011, this idea of humanitarian intervention. Well, every dictator uses humanitarian intervention. Hitler claimed he was going to protect German Jews in the Sudetenland with a humanitarian intervention. So all of this language can be abused. Everyone who commits a genocide acts like they're defending against a genocide and vice versa. So that doesn't mean it's not a genocide. It doesn't mean the Serbs didn't commit a genocide. It doesn't mean that there wasn't a genocide in Rwanda. It doesn't mean there's not a genocide happening in Gaza. The other thing people do, Owen, of course, is, well, they didn't kill all of them. And you actually nailed that argument, I remember back when you went on with Piers Morgan, which is you pointed out that, well, actually, Putin could drop a nuke on Ukraine and kill everyone. Does that mean Ukraine's not a genocide? Because Piers Morgan thinks Ukraine is a genocide. And so does Joe Biden.
It's astonishing. Like, does he not think genocides happen in the Americas? Because obviously not all indigenous. I mean, those genocides often happen over a long period of time. I mean, I think this is the problem of this discussion is just not informed by facts. I do wonder, I don't know, I suppose this is a British phenomenon, performative ignorance. It's almost like making a virtue of not knowing about history and then kind of rolling your eyes when anyone tries to begin contact. I was on Sky News a few weeks ago against this bizarre, surreal Israeli influencer.
This conflict raises a lot of emotions. I think we need to focus on reality. And I understand, especially when you are Jewish or Palestinian or Arab, why you feel so connected to this conflict and really being hurt and upset. I'm upset. My family, my friends, I lost friends in October 7th. I don't understand why you are so
because I object to genocide, because I'm a human being.
And of course it's not a genocide. Because
I'm a human being. That's
would you call every war a genocide? So
no,
why is it genocide?
Because you're seeing the deliberate attempt to starve a population to death, which Israel's own leaders said at the beginning. But basically, asked by the anchor basically to say, well, this is all in response to 7th of October. And then I started saying, well, and providing historical context. It's like, we don't have time for that. It's like, well, why ask me then? It's just any attempt to talk about context or history. Yeah.
I've said it very openly. The reason I founded Zeteo is because context. You don't have context in journalism. It's not really journalism, is it? It's just stenography. It's just repeating what people already know. So we're almost out of time, but we've got to talk about a big British story.
Yeah.
Big one. Elections. You guys have elections going on right now. You had elections on Thursday, but the counting still happened. Oh, everything's changed since I lived in the UK. We have to wait till Saturday afternoon. I don't know if people are watching if they've already got the London mayoral election result. I interviewed Sadiq Khan for it when we launched Zeteo a couple of weeks ago. He's up against this MAGA type conservative, Susan Hall. YouGov, I think, had a poll earlier this week that had him 20 points clear. So what's he been worried about?
It's funny, actually, because his camp actually are worried. And they're worried for a few reasons, which is most people don't vote in mayoral elections in London. So a general election, you look at the polling, you think, well, you can accurately predict basically how people vote pretty well. But the two problems are turnout is so variable in a mayoral election. And the other is taking a leaf out of the Republicans' book. They introduced voter ID. Disproportionately poorer voters who tend to vote Labour don't have, and younger voters, people who move around a lot, don't have voter ID. And there, people are being turned away at the polls or just think, I don't have any voter ID, so I can't turn up and vote. Interesting, Boris Johnson, by the way, the Tory Prime Minister introduced it. He got turned away from a polling station because he didn't have any valid ID, but it's often disproportionately kind of Labour voters. So they're worried because Susan Hall is she's like off the charts. She's like, she thought Liz Truss, who was Prime Minister and crashed the economy with deranged right-wing policies. She loved her. She loved Donald Trump, and that's such a fringe opinion, including on the right in Britain, to support that. She said terrible Islamophobic things. Just, you know, she's just beyond parody. I think the problem they've set, well, I'm just speaking to people, you know, who've been canvassing and trying to get people to come out and vote for Sadiq Khan, is even though he actually back in October, he called for ceasefire, said Israel were committing collective punishment. But even so, a lot of voters, they're angry with Labour in a place like London, where you've got lots of younger voters, you know, because people say, obviously Muslim voters as well, but it's not just Muslim voters who care about genocide. You know, there's the sorts of voters who particularly care about Gaza are more likely to be here. And I think...
I saw a Guardian headline, Owen, where Keir Starmer wrote a piece saying, vote for my friend Sadiq Khan. I was like, that's probably not that helpful right now. Because Keir Starmer is identified with someone who did support the genocidal acts by Israel soon after October the 7th. Sadiq Khan did come out against that and called for a ceasefire early on. Zoe Williams of The Guardian has written a piece this week pointing out that, if he wins, it'll be a real, you know, poke in the eye to the Islamophobes who can't stand him globally. He's become this kind of lightning rod for the far right. It will really piss them off if he wins again comfortably a third term. But also, she points out, like, the Islamophobia is so brazen when it comes to mayors. And she points to Andy Burnham, who has similar policies to Sadiq Khan in Manchester, also called for a ceasefire, but is a white dude called Andy. And Sadiq Khan, done similar stuff, gets crazy amount of hate, isn't as popular as Andy Burnham. And
because you caused the controversy. Well, you did.
Yeah, well, I
didn't cause the controversy.
Well, we'll talk about the controversy. Let's play the clip for people who haven't seen it. If you haven't seen it, why haven't you seen it? The Zateo interview, the Mehdi Unfiltered interview with Sadiq Khan. This is a clip where we talk about precisely this issue.
Very shortly after I called for a ceasefire, the Mayor of Greater Manchester called for a ceasefire. I've not seen the Chief Rabbi, the Jewish Chronicle, say comments said against me in relation to my calls for a ceasefire. I'd ask those Jewish people to just pause and reflect on their response to me calling for a ceasefire. What motivated them to come out in the way they did against the Mayor of London and the Mayor of Greater Manchester? I'll give you a clue. He's not called Ahmed Bourani, he's called Andy Burnham, whereas I'm called Sadiq Khan.
I mean, I think it's unfortunate he apologised, if I'm honest. You know, I mean...
He apologised to the Chief Rabbi last week. It was a huge controversy after our interview went out.
The Chief Rabbi is not beyond criticism approach, you know, and any religious figure or leader should be critiqued. And, you know, he's come out and, you know, he defended what he describes as our soldiers when he's talking about the IDF, which I think is extremely unfortunate. You know, lots of Jewish people obviously oppose what Israel is doing, and they oppose this heinous genocide. I think it's just an obvious double standard. Why is Sadiq Khan being singled out? He's taken the correct position. I mean, you know, it's unfortunate that, you know, like the bar is on the floor that we're having to, like, it should be given that politicians should oppose this atrocity on this sort of scale. But he isn't the only one to have done so. But he has been singled out. And you know what? Sadiq Khan, the amount of bile he gets, he's got 24-hour police protection. He's someone, actually, he's taken such a courageous stand. You know, it's quite striking. You know, he's a Muslim mayor who stands up for LGBTQ rights, but also stands up for the rights of, you know, you have to, multiculturalism. That's what London's all about. But the bile he gets, it's really poisonous.
But you can tell that they were worried about a close race because he immediately came out and apologized, even though I think, and I assume you think, there's nothing for him to apologize for. I mean, we're not politicians.
What's he apologizing for?
We're not trying to get votes and running in an election in London. But objectively, what he said was true. The Chief Rabbi and others in the Jewish community and others on the pro-Israel side and others in the right-wing media called him out for calling for a ceasefire, but didn't call Andy Burnham out for calling for a ceasefire. And it's funny, our friend, Stephen Pollard, former editor of the Jewish Chronicle, right-wing troll online, he went out of his way to say, because the Chief Rabbi happened to meet with Sadiq. That's why he asked about ceasefire. It wasn't a random attack on Sadiq Khan. Turns out, no, the Chief Rabbi also met with Andy Burnham the following month and tweeted about it, but didn't say a word about Andy Burnham's horrible, reckless ceasefire position. So I don't think he should have apologized. I think him winning will piss off a lot of the right people that should be pissed off. But the question is you came out and said you're voting for Sadiq Khan. You also came out before our last chat, before the inaugural episode of this Too Outspoken series, and you said you were leaving the Labour Party. So where does that leave you this week with Labour, I assume, making gains in local elections, Conservatives losing seats in local elections? Just for our global audience, Owen, just explain, the Conservative Party losing seats to governing party in these local elections, it's not good for them come the general election later this year, I assume.
No, the TLDR is the Tories face electoral Armageddon. I mean, there's, if you look at the sphologists, and I can never quite say that phrase. So John Curtis, he's like the big wig of polls in the country. So whenever there's a big election, he's always on the screens. He's giving the lowdown about what the polling all means. And his just a succinct, pithy description is they face an absolute calamity. What's striking, it's really interesting because this is all because of what the Tories have done. It's things like there was a Partygate scandal where they partied during the pandemic when people, their own rules they broke when people couldn't hold the hands of the dying relatives. They went through 3 prime ministers, one of which crashed the economy with deranged right-wing policies. Worst cost of living crisis in history. The NHS falling apart. Like any of these individually would be enough to finish off a government. So many scandals. Rishi Sunak, the prime minister, it's so over-promoted half the time.
He replaced a woman who couldn't outlast a lettuce, but for me, he has the charisma of a lettuce.
Well, he couldn't defeat her when he actually stood against her to be Tory leader. I think, but the point is, when you look at the polling about Labour, it's bad. I mean, there's no enthusiasm against him. He's got very negative ratings. He's going to be the most unpopular. This is what's so weird about it. He's the most unpopular leader of the opposition to become prime minister. I presume he's going to be prime minister. If you look at the fact he's going to win a landslide victory, it's quite striking. You see, the same poll will say, they ask the public who you're going to vote for, and they make it clear there's going to be a landslide victory for the Labour Party. And then they ask them what they think about Keir Starmer, and they have negative views about him. He's like -20. He's like, that wasn't the case with Tony Blair. It was a different era. I'm not a fan of Tony Blair, but it was not like New Labour in the 90s. And the point that a pollster, really good pollster, found it, a kind of Peter Kellner who founded YouGov, who's a kind of Blair supporting kind of guy. But he said, he did a really interesting piece saying something's going to have to give, in that Labour are likely, obviously, to walk this election. But you can't have a situation where frontline politicians of all parties are that unpopular for that long without other parties maybe getting a look in. And actually, what's interesting is the Greens are doing well in this election. What is disturbing, and this just shows, we talked about Islamophobia. So, for example, in the West Midlands, it looks like the Conservatives are going to keep the mayoralty. They've defeated Labour despite the fact that Labour are doing well otherwise. And one of the reasons is because some have voted for a independent candidate called Ahmed Yaqub, who stood on a pro-Gaza ticket. And a senior Labour Party source briefed a journalist saying, it's the Middle East, not West Midlands, that will have won the Conservative candidate, the mayoralty. Once again, Hamas are the real villains. And that's not the first example of just rampant Islamophobia by a Labour Party, which just treats Muslims.
I've never heard the Hamas excuse for a local election loss. That's a real, that's a new one. What I would say, listening to you, Owen, is it reminds me of that old saying that oppositions don't win elections, governments lose them. And I think that applies in the UK very much, as you're eloquently laying out. And I think it applies here in the US, where Joe Biden right now, it's really on him to win or lose. It's not Donald Trump who's going to win the election through his own charisma, success, or popularity. It's going to be because Joe Biden can't get his own side out. If Joe Biden gets his own side out, he wins, right?
But that's what I was going to ask you, because I just think there's still this tendency, isn't there, the kind of establishment Democrat types to go. So basically, when you've got disillusioned voters over, minor things like genocide, they go, vote Trump, you're an idiot, you're an idiot. And I just think that point I made earlier about that polling, I just think is unbelievable. You've literally forced voters in a situation where most of your voters think you are facilitating a genocide. That is a moral stain people are going to have to carry for the rest of their life. They're going to have to walk into go and vote, make a vote, and they're voting for someone they think is facilitating a genocide. That something's got to give there, surely, with democracy, when you're forcing people to make that kind of choice.
And that's why there's a big debate in this country right now. Well, not a big debate, a growing debate, I think it's fair to say, about among young people for sure, about two-party systems. And the UK has traditionally had, a 2.5-party system. But, when I lived there was a big debate about proportional representation. I was in favor of it. You're now in support of some smaller parties. You're telling people to vote for the Greens or independents where they can. Here, I had Cornel West on the show last week. People do want to vote for a third party, but the counter argument is it helps Trump. Look, again, it comes back to a simple point. You are in control of your own destiny. Joe Biden can do what needs to be done to avoid absolute calamity come November and a Trump return. And similarly in the UK, well, Starmer's going to win anyways, but not through, as you say, any popularity or good politics of his own. We are out of time for today's Too Outspoken. We may have been too outspoken that we have to stop being outspoken for today. We will be back. Oh, and I hope I'll see you in a couple of weeks for another chat. At some point soon, I do want to tell the people watching. I don't know when, but at some point soon, Owen and I are going to do this with all of you. We're going to do a kind of live town hall where you can come in and ask some questions and grill us if you'd like. Or heckle, disagree. Obviously, it'll be in written format. So good luck heckling in written format. But we will take your questions. For now, I hope you keep watching. I hope you keep subscribing to Zeteo. I hope you keep reading Owen, watching Owen, reading and watching me. We love your support. Thank you so much, Owen. Always a pleasure.
You too, buddy. Speak soon.
Cheers.